seen Luca Guadagnino's new film After the Hunt, and I can report that it is the worst of the three films on this subject that I've seen in the last few years. All these films concern sexual assault accusations on campus or in an organization. The first is Tar with Cate Blanchett. Then we had Sorry Baby earlier this year, and now we have After the Hunt. I have to say, it doesn't have Tar's scope. It has all the problems of Tar, you could say, of stereotyping some of the characters with none of the development that Tar also had. It doesn't have Sorry Baby's authenticity or empathy. Instead, it's extremely busy. It doesn't have much space for any of its characters, and that becomes a serious problem when we're talking about Ayo Edebiri's character, who is the victim, she says, of a sexual assault by Andrew Garfield's character, who is a putative tenured academic. He's trying to get tenure. That's part of the storyline. And the main role is taken by Julia Roberts, who has to somehow negotiate between the alternate demands of her mentee, Ayo Edebiri, and her almost romantic partner, Andrew Garfield, who is not her husband. She's got a husband who barely features as a real character, but she sort of seems to cultivate the adoration of Andrew Garfield and Ayo Edebiri. So the film is kind of about her flailing narcissism, but it's also about the trauma that's behind that narcissism. It can't make up its mind what of all of these themes it really wants to focus on. And the result is a ragbag of scenes that never really develop anything. As I say, I think that becomes a real problem with the Ayo Edebiri character, because what Nora Garrett, who's written this script, has done is really plunge into the justifications and the rationalizations and the storyline of the Andrew Garfield character. Yes, we lose a lot of hinterland with him, but we do know what his account of events is, and we also know what the meaning of that account is to some extent in the course of the story. We get a sense of him as a figure. The Ayo Edebiri figure is not developed in the same way. I notice that the scenes where she's starting to articulate her position on various things are always foreshortened. Some of that, there's a kind of responsibility to it, in that she's not really willing to share her perspective with the Julia Roberts character because she doesn't trust her. But in other scenes, I just felt like when she was about to develop as a character, she would walk away, or there would be some distraction or a climax, or someone would enter. I mean, a classic moment is when she and Julia Roberts' character are having a conversation about what has happened to her, and another woman interrupts and they have to stop, and it takes all the momentum away. It's kind of a joke about how difficult it is for them to have this conversation. I mean, a structural joke in that they keep getting interrupted, but it's also, in the end, it lets the film off the hook because it never has to explore that character. Instead, she's like an overloaded symbol. She's made to be she's like a series of stereotypical tropes about Gen Z, like, well, she's privileged, but she's a feminist, but she's got a non-binary partner, and she's also very wealthy. So you kind of get she's overloaded with meaning. It's as though she's got to embody all these different, slightly condescending views of the younger generation by the older generations. And she never really gets a chance to have a voice of her own. Some of that is explored interestingly. As I say, some of the film starts to become about the terms on which someone might speak. There's a very interesting scene where they're talking about, I think it's Ulysses recognizing himself in the figure of a poet, a blind poet, singing back to him. And Julia Roberts, says, you know what, this is seeing yourself through the eyes of the other, or in this case, the blind eyes of the other, that they have real insight into you that you don't have. And one of the students in the class, who is a young woman of color, says, who is the other here? And Julia Roberts turns on her and says, you're trying to politicize something which is this kind of lyric reality in this text. It's an interesting moment, but it reminded me of that scene in Tar where a young student tries to point out to the Kate Blanchett character that they only focus on dead white males. But the way he articulates that position, first of all, it's scripted as the most superficial articulation of that position. It's like there's absolutely no nuance to it at all. I've never heard anyone articulate it in quite that basic a way. And then she gets a chance to grandstand and overrule him completely. That's the way it's scripted. And it's kind of the same here, where just as we're about to get the position where we discuss the terms on which we represent the other, it's shut down and it becomes about the central character's psychological breakdown. I think it's a pity. I think there's an opportunity for a really interesting film on the subject of how do we find a language to talk about extremely different life experiences? Who gets to say what is true and what is not true? I think it would also be really interesting if that were rooted in a genuine account of institutions. For example, I think Hollywood has yet to make the film that really needs to be made, which is what is the law on sexual assault? How do we articulate in language and in law what needs to be said about this issue? We always stop short of that, and it becomes about interpersonal politics in these films without any real sense of structure or of legal complexity. And I think that's the next stage. I'd love to see a film on that subject. It looks at one point like this film is going to be about that, but then predictably it becomes about journalism, which tends to be the direction that these films take. They become about public shaming and mobs. I mean, Sorry Baby doesn't do that, to its credit, but the other films do. And I think I think we've exhausted that subject. What made Sorry Baby so good was that it was a genuine discussion of trauma, which is much more to the point, I think, and more interesting. And when this film actually gets going on Julia Roberts' character and her background, I found that quite interesting. I actually started to see the character as a four-dimensional figure. There's a final section where we realize this has all been set a few years ago and we move to the present day. Again, there are some interesting moments. I won't say what happens, but you sort of do get almost an interesting ending. But again, it doesn't quite manage it because it reduces the characters to stereotypes. I don't think this film was scripted properly. No matter how well the actors try to handle the script, they can't move past its limitations. Luca Guadagnino is making films too quickly. He keeps churning them out. They're always on a new erotic and cultural issue, and I think he's come a cropper with this one, to be honest.